From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics in the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. This is round two, trying to record this podcast. We did have some technical errors the first time, but hopefully it sounds seamless to the listener or the viewer. I'm joined today by a familiar face and a new face. Emma Lydick is a familiar face. She's been on the show at least once before on a Gen Z roundtable a few months back, and she was a very popular guest, so we're happy to have her back. Emma, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, and I really enjoyed being on this podcast in the past. Excited to talk about my interests today. Yeah, so I'm the secretary of the Politics and Leadership Club. So that was the last time I was here, but again, glad to be back.
Excellent. Well, welcome back, Emma. And our fresh new face is Andrew Ritter. Andrew, can you tell the viewers and the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Oh yeah, of course. First of all, Rob, I just want to thank you so much. Well, you and our good friend Jack for inviting me on the show. It's really an honor. But so my name's Andrew Ritter. I'm a freshman here at ASU. I literally just started last semester. I've been loving it here. I'm not originally from Arizona. I'm actually from New Mexico, kind of near the Albuquerque area, but kind of like a small town just outside Albuquerque. I'm majoring in international relations, but I'm looking towards dual majoring in Chinese as well, especially through the Chinese flagship program, which, if we could talk about that a little bit later, great program. But I do work with, I go to Politics and Leadership Club. I do work with Model United Nations here at ASU. And those are basically my main areas of focus. And it's great to be on the show.
Welcome. We earlier in the week, we did an episode on India, the United States and Japan, and the United States and India. So I think we're having a Pacific-themed week here on Politics in the Past. And South Dakota Jack and I decided to talk about, we wanted to talk about China and Taiwan, and we couldn't think of two people that we knew better to come on and talk about that than Emma and Andrew. Andrew, you did mention the flagship program, so I'm going to get you to tell us a little bit about the flagship program here at ASU.
Oh, yeah, sure. So the Chinese flagship program is a program at ASU which basically you learn Chinese, but what's interesting about it is I guess whenever I was going to ASU, I was very surprised at the amount of Chinese language resources that were available at ASU, because when you think of ASU, it's in the middle of Phoenix, Arizona. Arizona's not known for having really a large Chinese community, but I can confidently say the Chinese flagship program at ASU is probably one of the best flagship programs for Chinese on this side of the Mississippi. It's genuinely an amazing program. Basically, it's not only a language learning program, it's a cultural immersion program. And in your capstone year, you actually get the opportunity to go to China or Taiwan, although lately you can only go to Taiwan because of recent issues that we've been seeing. But it's basically an accelerated Chinese learning program. I guess to provide an example for me, I started doing tutoring this semester, and my speaking skills have gone up through the roof. 我教会我会说中文，可是我的中文话不好。Emma will know hopefully what I'm saying. I can speak it, but I'm not the best. But I'm getting there. But the Chinese flagship program is a genuinely amazing program. It's led by the director Corinne Horton, who's genuinely an amazing person. She works over at Silk, School of International Letters and Cultures. Yeah, if you're interested in Chinese culture, Chinese politics, history, anything that's even remotely relating to China, I would check it out. But that's my whole little spiel, and I know, Corinne would be proud.
Well, we'll have to let her know about it. All right, and Emma,
of course.
Tell us a little bit about your experience with Mandarin and Chinese history enrichment here at Arizona State.
Yeah, so I'm technically a political science major because the IR major wasn't available at ASU when I got here, but now I get to take tons of the IR classes, so that's great as well. And then I'm not in the specific Chinese flagship program, but I have had the opportunity to utilize a lot of the same resources that they have. So the tutoring, the teachers, those are all great. And then a lot of the like cultural classes have been excellent as well. I'll say I was a little intimidated my freshman year on like committing to being fluent in Chinese by the time I left. So I was a little intimidated, but it clearly there's tons of resources at ASU and you really can do it. So I've really enjoyed just kind of cherry picking my Chinese class experience, but each one has been great. And now, because of my experience, I'm going to be trying to go to Taiwan next year and hopefully kind of solidify that immersion in by practicing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's incredible. Um, and really, what you're supposed to do with the university experience is you have 4 years of your life to be able to do things like this, and that's really taking advantage of it. So good for you guys. Okay, so I would like to talk a little bit about maybe where your interest in China comes from. Um, this is it, as you mentioned, Andrew. The Valley area. There's a pretty significant Chinese population and population here, but it's not the largest that you'll certainly find in the United States. So, um, yeah. So,
Yeah.
Emma, let's start with you. What got you interested in learning learning Chinese history and Chinese politics?
Yeah, so it started in my high school years. I was working on this project. It was kind of an independent research project that I wanted to focus on social psychology originally, and then throughout the course of about a year and a half that I was working on this, it morphed into Chinese like citizen social psychology, and then as the project evolved, it just became more and more IR focused. I thought I wanted to do psych, but the paper became completely IR by the end of it. I was just the reason I'm so fascinated with China is just the difference in like democratic systems versus authoritarian systems and how they've been able to progress at such a rapid rate and how like the reasons it's developed differently than our system. So starting again in high school, I did the social psychology of like Chinese citizens versus like US citizens and how they perceive the relationship. And from there, I've been pretty committed ever since to like focusing on this region of the world and trying to work in some sort of international relations sense around it.
Interesting. So, what did you on the social psychology? What were some of the differences that you identified?
So I again it was in high school, so it was a little earlier, but I got to get into a lot of the principles like collectivism versus individualism, and kind of just understanding the role of Confucian hierarchy in Chinese society in the sense of there's like less reluctance to maybe government overreach and things like that, and then just those little like cultural differences that allow the Chinese state to progress faster than the US with some more democratic friction inside. So it was kind of mainly looking at how the systems, like the domestic systems, the cultural of the domestic systems allows for global progress on the like
Okay,
global
so
scale.
the argument or sort of identifying that in the Chinese there were aspects of Chinese culture which plays a role in Chinese psychology, maybe of the individual Chinese citizen that um, allows for greater encroachment on personal liberties from the center, from an authoritarian regime, than would be possible in an American regime, just because there's sort of these psychological and cultural safeguards against it that might not exist for
Hmm.
various reasons in Chinese history. Andrew, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Emma, before I forget, I want you. Can you talk a little bit about Confucian hierarchy?
Yeah. So the main reason I started focusing on Confucian hierarchy is because I when I was getting into the collectivism versus individualism idea, I didn't understand kind of where it originated from. And so what I've come to like focus on Confucian hierarchy, like in the sense of having a social place and for individuals having a place in society that is again more collectivist. Essentially, the Confucian hierarchy allows like individuals in Chinese society to again be a little more flexible with conforming their individual liberties for societal progress. And it's within that Confucian hierarchy that just kind of like respects and has trust in the top leadership, that we don't have the same level of kind of like instilled trust in our higher ups. I feel like in the government, sometimes we have a little more speculation. So because of that, like trust and strong hierarchical system that they've built up, it's again just a little more institutional trust that allows for
Sure, there's
progress.
just sort of this instilled faith or instilled respect for authority
Mm-hmm.
that might not that well, I am desperate to instill that in my daughter, and I'm failing miserably at it. Um, so yeah, interesting. Okay, Andrew, I want to move over to you here. What got you interested in studying China?
I guess to preface, I've always been into history. I've always been a real history buff. And in high school, I was in this program called National History Day. And I remember in my sophomore year of high school, me and my friends were working on this website. And the great thing about National History Day, you can make a historical project on any historical topic as long as it like relates to like a yearly rotating theme. And the theme that year was like new frontiers in history. And we decided to focus on the Opium Wars, which I didn't really know much about. And what we did in that website, we looked at the Opium Wars and how it opened up new economic, political, and social frontiers. Because in the span of 100 years, China went from being the continuation of a 3,000-year-old dynastic cycle to a fledgling republic, and then eventually a warlord, like a combination of warlord states, and then eventually a communist state, all in the span of 100 years. And I thought that process was fascinating, but it's not what really hooked me in. I think what really began to hook me in was junior year, NHD, same thing, but this time me and my friends were doing a project on the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And what actually got me into China was we were looking at how like the whole broader area of like the Indochina conflict was influenced by these foreign powers. And when we looked at Cambodia, China played a crucial role in keeping Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge alive. And they went so far to, like, as in 1979, whenever Vietnam invaded Cambodia to overthrow the Khmer Rouge. It was very interesting because China propped up the Khmer Rouge to fight the Soviet-backed Vietnam. And it was an interesting case of seeing how there were, like, internal conflicts within the communist world. We often see, like, the communist world as being unified as one, but no, not really. I mean, they really began to split in the 60s, but yeah, that and then after that, I started looking into Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. I haven't really looked much into Xi Jinping, but then I did go back reading into Mao. My main area of expertise is definitely probably modern Chinese history, like the past maybe 150 years, but that's basically how I got into China is the history and where we're seeing China heading towards now, because China has so much potential as a power on the global stage that I'm really interested to see where they go.
Interesting. Well, Andrew, the Sino-Soviet split, especially the way that plays out in Asia, that needs to be a podcast of its own one day. Because that's about
For sure.
There's about
For
300
sure.
hours of possibly interesting content there. But I do want to just talk about a couple of things that you brought up in Chinese history because I think it's relevant to the way that the Chinese government's propaganda, the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, at least works today. I'm going to leave the Opium Wars aside for a second because again, it's kind of like it's kind of a rabbit hole that we could spend again too much time talking about. But in the wake of the Chinese Revolution in 1911, which is led by Sun Yat-sen and the what becomes the KMT, the Nationalist Party. They don't really succeed like they kind of intend to succeed, right? And there is this period of warlordism that you brought up, the Baiyang period in Chinese history, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think we can understand modern Chinese history until we really, understand that period, because it felt like this period of weakness and fracturing, and then of course, you get Chiang Kai-shek, right, is trying to create a new national polity. But are you able to maybe? I do think that notion of warlordism, of the fracturing, kind of plays a role in the modern consciousness of China. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that period?
Guess the best, well, I mean, the best way to simplify, like, for people who don't really know a lot about this, like, period of Chinese history is, like, imagine the American Revolution. The 13 colonies, they break away from the United Kingdom, but immediately right after that, each colony basically just becomes independent and they're headed by a general. Like, George Washington's in charge of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson or someone, or like Benjamin Franklin's in charge of like Pennsylvania, and they're all fighting each other. For China, the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 was the first real break from any sort of dynastic system. Like, because for the past 3,000, I mean, even 4,000 years ago, if you want to go back to the mythical, like, Shang and, like, Xia dynasties, China had been in some way ruled by a king, or eventually what we would see, an emperor. But because of the culmination of all these influences for the past 70 years before, this kind of, like, break away from the imperial system that was the guiding force of Chinese civilization for thousands of years. I would say it's the birth of the modern Chinese, like the modern Chinese state as it is, because I mean, both, like, despite the differences that the KMT and Taiwan have and the CCP and the mainland have, they both revere Sun Yat-sen. They both revere that original KMT. They see it as kind of like uncorrupted. Like, in a way, Sun Yat-sen's almost kind of like their Jesus figure. And then, like the stuff that happens after that, it gets a little bit more conflict, especially with the warlord era, Chiang Kai-shek, and the conflict he would have with the communists. But the influence of Sun Yat-sen cannot be understated. Like, in Taiwan, they have a calendar. I don't know what the exact name of it is, but they measure it in the amount of years it's been since the Xinhai Revolution, like, in the Xinhai Revolution. So while it's 2026 in Taiwan, it's also year 115 in Taiwan too. They have their own calendar. So that initial revolution, the Xinhai Revolution, it was really the birth of the modern Chinese state, and it kind of served as like the original mythos, or like founding story of both the communist state on the mainland and the republican state in Taiwan. That's where it all
No,
began.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's great. I mean, I think that really that notion of Sun Yat-sen as sort of this uncorrupted, and each side, the communists and the nationalists, believe themselves the legitimate inheritors of Sun Yat-sen's legacy, right? And they believe the other side are, blasphemers or something of some form.
Yeah.
But okay, Emma, you're you're preparing, or you spent thinking about Taiwan. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe how Taiwan thinks of its place in this history?
Yeah, I have a little less context on the initial
No,
warlord era
I'm not
separation in
necessarily looking for
history.
that. I'm sort of like, where does Taiwan see
Okay.
itself
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of the, Taiwan seeing itself as the legitimate inheritor of the Chinese nationalist tradition, or China generally.
The thing about Taiwan domestically is that it can be so. The domestic politics are mixed, and that can sometimes have a difficult read on understanding because, of course, there's a party. One of the major parties is more aligned with the PLA, and then one is more resistant. So I think generally there is like an understanding that I guess
No, no.
sorry
Actually,
that
let me
Taiwan
rephrase the question.
is
Let me rephrase the
uh,
question, because I didn't ask it in a very good
yeah.
way, and I want to rephrase it. What I'm so glad you brought up the fact that Taiwan has a very divisive domestic politics. Is there anything they agree on in Taiwan?
I know they agree on semiconductor chips. I know they agree on silicon shield. That is certainly for sure. Even if you are in favor of reunification with China. I think they've all come to embrace the strategic benefit that comes with the Silicon Shield, even though it was kind of initiated as a deterrent. That has brought so much wealth and prosperity to the nation. That's certainly something that is, I would say, domestically well supported. However, definitely when we get into other topics domestically, Taiwan is a lot more divided. Again, it's all really around that like main China conflict that I see most of the divisiveness like actually being portrayed. But I think there's some difference in primarily right now is just like what the extent of the military buildup that is necessary to combat China, because people who are a little more favorable to PLA don't think as much investment should be going into defense spending. And then on the other side of the aisle, there's a really, really significant push for defense spending in the next couple of years to kind of offer at least some domestic basis of capability to defend, and then hopefully court international support.
Yeah, I mean, and we saw, when was the election held? Last year, the year before?
The election, wait, I think it's 2024, right? Yeah, I believe it'd be 2024 because I believe Xi Jinping's up for re-election 2027, and then the Taiwanese elections follow the year after in 2028.
And in 2024, sure, more ardent nationalist party won a surprisingly large majority, correct?
Yes, that is my understanding. I didn't have as much of a chance to keep up in the post. However, I was in Taiwan right before that election, which was like extremely fascinating, just getting like to talk to people, because it was very, even though the victory was a little more significant than expected, the people in Taiwan in advance of the election really did not seem to have any definitive idea which party was going to win. It still felt very up in the air. And that was just kind of interesting. And the individuals I talked to specifically weren't surely as, I guess, partisan or hardline one way or the other. So since I didn't hear a lot of like super inflamed political rhetoric, it was interesting to see how the election played out. That was not my prediction after just talking to a few people.
It's also difficult when you come from the United States and you go to another democratic country. There doesn't seem to be much inflamed political rhetoric here. Well, that's because there's never very much inflamed political rhetoric compared to the United States.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely different.
Okay, Andrew, what is, what do you think you mentioned you haven't really thought much about the Xi Jinping era, although I think you've had to. Are you able to maybe take us back to Mao and kind of walk us through maybe some of the progressions China sees its place in the world under a communist state?
That's a big undertaking, but I'll try my best. So where we really got to go back is honestly, I'm going to make this brief, like we'll get to 1949, but in 1927, Mao basically becomes not the official, but the de facto leader of the CCP. He's one of the main leaders of the CCP, and the CCP at this time, they're based in southern China in, I think it's like Jiangxi province, kind of near Shanghai. And Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the nationalists, he ordered basically a whole bunch of communists in Shanghai to be killed. And what we would see is that the communists would establish their own little Soviet in Jiangxi province. But like the nationalists, like Chiang Kai-shek saw Mao, saw them as a threat. So he had them encircled and he tried to destroy them. And basically what would happen, and this is very important, is Mao and his, and the party, they would attempt to break out. They'd actually succeed, and they would go on what would be known as the Long March, and march like 7,000 kilometers around China. Like they got to like the foothills of Tibet. They were marching through desert, but eventually they end up in northern China, somewhat near where Xi'an province is, kind of near like the Yellow River Valley, but it's a very mountainous, kind of near Mongolia, place in the middle of nowhere. They set up their new base of operations, basically, Japan's right at the footsteps. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao decide to put their differences aside and to unite to fight the Japanese. So in 37, Japan invades China, and for the next couple years until 1945, the communists and nationalists, they begin to work together, and what's it called again? They push. Eventually, Japan gets nuked, and then yeah, World War II ends. China is reunified on paper, but what we're seeing is that the communists, especially Mao, takes over northern China. The Soviets give Mao Manchuria, and basically the Civil War reignites in 46. And then, yeah, the communists push back down to. He left again. He left again.
Oh no. I'm like, hopefully
The
we
internet.
can cut it.
Yeah, I think we could cut it.
Yeah. Oh,
No, 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 no. I do not want to call him. I accidentally called. Whoops.
God.
Whoops. Hopefully you didn't get that.
Let's see. Hopefully you'll be able to join back in. Oh, you are well versed in the history. Wow,
Th-
I would not have been
thank
able to give a timeline. That's wow. Like,
No, thank you so
yeah.
much. I've actually spent like I'm not joking. I'm really looking at my bookshelf and I have like a couple
Yeah.
books on like Chinese history. It's like it's
Oh.
so fascinating. I think what it
Eh,
is, it's the fact that China is like the only like it's like the oldest continuous surviving civilization. To me, it's like what if Europe was one country that had survived for 3,000 years? Like if the Roman Empire was just like the size of Europe and they survived till the present day. Like
That
no
is an
other country
interesting way
has
to think of
really
it.
changed, has
Yeah.
really survived in like not the same form because of course it's changed, but in
Yeah.
like a similar form for that long.
Mm-hmm. It really is so long. I'm curious, like, if you have any Chinese book history recommendations on your bookshelf, I'd be interested
Actually,
to.
I
Yeah.
gotta actually I'm looking at them right now. There's this
Okay.
one
Let me
book.
see.
There's this one book called well, okay, I have it like reoriented like vertically because I don't have enough room in my bookshelf, so it's kind of hard to. Ugh, I don't know if I'll be able to get it off. No, but it's called Mao: The Unknown Story by Jung Chang, and it's
Okay.
kind of a lot of people call it like a revisionist history of Mao, but
Mm.
it's a very critical history of Mao, and it goes very into detail of like the power struggles that took place in the CCP from like kind of whenever you were starting, even towards the
Mm-hmm.
end there, because it's a common misconception that Mao was basically like Stalin, where if you question Stalin, you would
Right.
be killed. The CCP just does not function like that. The CCP, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not defending the CCP. I don't like the CCP, but the CCP, like the form of competition, in a way, it's somewhat akin to kind of like the old imperial like system, but it's like you can very easily move up the chain of command fast, and you can, and the former like the leader could very easily become like the former leader. It's very
Mm-hmm.
fascinating.
Yeah, that's it's very fascinating. No, that's very interesting. Oh, welcome
Welcome
back.
back,
Chinese
Rob.
Politburo, Chinese Politburo leadership politics is always fascinating. One of the things about Mao that I think can never be underestimated, and when you're studying him, is that he comes to power in what is probably the most vicious political system in the world. The Chinese Central Committee Politburo politics is unbelievably sophisticated, unbelievably ruthless, and unbelievably brutal.
I
And so
I
the
was
fact,
yeah, yeah. Oh my bad. I was literally like while you got disconnected, I was explaining to Emma kind of how like there's a common misconception that Mao was kind of like well, like Mao was basically untouchable. You couldn't touch him. But a lot of the times, like even from his early days all the way towards the end, there were real power struggles where Mao could have gotten overthrown. Mao could have easily ended up dead or forced into retirement. And I think that's something people should really be like consider. I was recommending to her, and I would recommend to the audience this book called Mao: The Untold Story by Jung Chang. It's a very like critical approach to kind of Mao's rise to power, and it goes into a lot of the detail of kind of a lot of the power struggles. There was this one story about how during the Long March, they were in I think they were in like Sichuan province. Mao was told by like because he technically wasn't the leader, but he was told by the central leadership to meet up with this general. Mao only had 10,000 men under his control. This general had 100,000 men. So what he did, he told that general, meet up with us, but go through this giant swamp. And so the general went through the swamp, and most of his men died, but he did that. So by the time the general got there, Mao dwarfed him in terms of power. He had more men than him. And it's just kind of that political calculus that Mao possessed is what allowed him to become one of the most powerful men of the 20th century. It's very fascinating.
And ruthless.
Ruthless. Like, I don't know, like, I don't like to compare it like, oh, it's more ruthless than Stalin, but definitely comparable. Very comparable.
Agreed.
But yeah.
Agreed. And, you mentioned that he was almost pushed out. He was pushed out after the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for a while.
And,
like, technically, he was still leader, but it was Liu Shaoqi that basically, like, let's stop the Great Leap Forward. But he would have his revenge later with the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I think people forget about or people who don't know don't really understand about the Cultural Revolution, is the Cultural Revolution was Mao's attempt to regain power.
Yeah. Do you want me to continue where you got disconnected?
No. I want you to continue from where you left off, not from where I left off.
Yeah, sure. Okay. But yeah, no, basically, so yeah, Mao took control, but I guess what's the most important thing in just looking at political developments in China is that reign from 1949 to 1976 is very unstable politically. Although Mao is technically the leader, he's the paramount leader. He holds a lot of these key positions in the Chinese government. He's always fighting to stay on top. Like during the Great Leap Forward, they were attempting to industrialize China, but the casualties and the deaths that were mounting because of famine, disease, and all these different factors were so bad that the president of the I don't know what the exact term is, but of their version of Congress, like the Assembly, Liu Shaoqi, he basically told Mao to stop. And a couple years later, in 1960s, the Cultural Revolution starts, and it's exactly what Rob was saying. It's Mao's attempt at getting power back, and although in a way he did kind of succeed, he was getting old at that point. He was in his 70s by that point because he was born in 1893, and he was starting to develop health conditions. So there were other people in the party that were starting to supersede him and become more politically important. There was the Gang of Four, which I can't name off the top of my head, but Qiang Liang, which was Mao's wife, was one of them, and there was I do not know, but the Gang of Four was they wanted to continue Mao's policies. Basically, they wanted to be the continuation of Mao. But we fast forward to 1976, Mao's on his deathbed and he dies, and there's this power struggle where the successor to Mao is this guy that no one knows about named Hua Guofeng, and he's really only in charge for 2 years, and he's basically propped up by the Gang of Four, but by 1978, you have Deng Xiaoping and his allies. They take control of the Chinese government, and they had the Gang of Four thrown in prison or executed. Mao's wife, died in 1994. Which, when we think about Mao, we think he's so old, but his wife really only died 30 years ago. But so Deng Xiaoping, he really begins to open up China. The groundwork was laid whenever Nixon visited Mao in the 1970s, and the PRC became the official representative for China in the UN. But Deng Xiaoping really opens up China, and for the next 10, 12 years, the Chinese economy really begins to bloom, begins to blossom. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a free market. It's still heavily, tightly controlled, but there's test cities. Shenzhen becomes a special economic zone where we could test this kind of state, the state market, where technically it's all under the purview of the state, but there's some level of economic anarchy that we see in kind of a free market, and it works. And then Western investors really begin to invest. It kind of starts in the 80s, but it really picks off in the 90s. But a critical moment in terms of politics is Tiananmen Square, because there was all this growth, and there was kind of it seemed as if China was connecting to the rest of the international world, that by the end of the 80s, it seemed that China was going to become a normal nation. They were going to democratize, liberalize. But then we get to Tiananmen Square, and at that same time, there were all the events happening in Eastern Europe, the Berlin Wall was coming down. Now, the CCP leadership, they did not want to become East Germany, the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania. And so when Tiananmen Square happened, they had a harsh crackdown. So what we were expecting to see was this kind of fall of communism would happen to China. No, it actually reinforced the CCP's hold. Granted, they had to make I don't know. I don't think they had to make they didn't really have to make much concessions, but they had a military crackdown. The initial wave of liberalization, it ended. But after that, Deng Xiaoping really kind of fell out of the party's graces, and then Jiang Zemin took over, who gets overlooked, but he's known as the caretaker president. He really began to kind of push forward what Deng Xiaoping laid out. Foreign investments in China really began to pick up in the 90s. GDP per capita really went up. China launched their first space program in the 90s, and then by the 2000s, we get to Hu Jintao, who the economic foundations have already been laid out, but now we begin to see the cultural foundations. Hu Jintao helped set up a variety of Confucius institutes around the world. He helps to spread like Chinese language and culture, like learning programs around the world. And so Hu Jintao is responsible for kind of the cultural, like the soft influence of China in terms of culture. And then we get to Xi Jinping. Now Xi Jinping, he continues off of Hu Jintao and Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, but although he's still continuing in spreading the soft power of Chinese culture and Chinese economy, his main accomplishment, I would say, is his foreign policy. He pioneered the Belt and Road Initiative. Like as we're speaking right now, the U.S. and Iran have that ceasefire agreement in place, and we're just getting breaking news that Pakistan and China helped to break that ceasefire, which is honestly, I don't think we should be surprised considering the amount of diplomatic leverage that China holds, but this is a first that China was able to mediate in a conflict with America. Like, this is completely unheard of, but Xi's accomplishments, I think, will be how he basically expanded Chinese foreign policy. I mean, China has more embassies in more countries than we do. I would argue that China has a more favorable position in the UN than we do. The economic packages, although they're very manipulative and they often get a lot of these countries into debt traps and like basically just make them debt slaves to China, it has worked in kind of making China look more favorable to the international community. But the final thing I will say on Xi Jinping is that he probably has more power than any other Chinese leader since Mao. Not as much power as Mao, but he's definitely developing his own cult of personality. He's centralized leadership. I mean, just recently, back in January, he purged the the top general in the Chinese army, Zheng Yaoxia, and again, reunification is always on the table, and I think those purges were probably had something to do with an attempt at reunification, because although China is looking to reunify with Taiwan, I don't know if it'll go. They don't have the military experience. They don't really have the experience to pull something off. If they utilize their economic soft power, maybe they could do it. But a military invasion would just be suicide, especially considering Taiwan's been preparing for this for decades now. But yeah, those have been a very oversimplified version of the major like Chinese political developments from the time of Mao, basically. But yeah.
No, that was a great summary. No, seriously, that was a really great summary. I was leaning back and listening and enjoying it. That was really great.
Thank you so much.
No, and again, we're definitely going to have a more specific Chinese history podcast here. In fact, this is all right. During COVID, I launched a serial history podcast that I did 2 seasons of, and that was it. Then I got too much stuff. But the first season I did was on the Black Plague, and the second season that I did that never actually got released. I recorded it, but it never actually got released, and I have no idea where it is. Was all about was Mao and the Cultural Revolution, and it kind of starts with kind of going back to 1911 and going all the way through. I do wish I still had it, but anyway, I'd like to be able to recover that in some other form. So that would be we'll have you guys on for that at some point. But Emma, let's what does this mean for the world that you've had? What Andrew has just laid out is this pretty remarkable transformation over the course of the last 80 years, essentially, of a country into one of the 2 foremost powers of the world. What does this mean for the world? How has the world viewed this?
So That's a lot of what I focus on in my current research for my thesis. Right now, I think the main way the current world is like adjusting to China becoming a relative to equal size superpower as the United States is we're experiencing bureaucration on like sorry, we're not experiencing the expected bureaucration in like economic standards and regulatory convergence and things like that that we would have seen in like the Cold War. So it's like the main thing is China is very different from the USSR's position in the Cold War. So you like China has an insurmountable amount of economic influence compared to the Cold War at the time for just in terms of interconnected economy and things like that. So right now, what we're seeing is as China's able to compete with the U.S. capability wise, we are seeing a lot of soft power tactics used to kind of Andrew brought up with the Belt and Road Initiative, offering funding to kind of get coercive elements or dependencies and things like this to build up China's support system, even though they have less of an ideological support system because they don't kind of work off that ideological basis for international relationships. However, as we are seeing a shift from in the United States from some of the ideological based international relationships, China has really snuck in that gap and tried to kind of become the new reliable global partner for a lot of countries. So, we saw I believe it was the partnership with Canada recently. Things they're trying to slip in the cracks of U.S. Alliance erosion or any tad like deflections into alliances. They're trying to slip in, become a more reliable partner, and prove that they may not be ideologically aligned, but they are consistent. And that is a very important capability for countries who are going to be basically revolutionizing their entire industrial system around AI and capabilities that China will also be trying to produce and compete with the US on.
Right. It's one of the, China has sort of framed itself and positioned itself as like we don't actually, as the arch realist power in international relations, sense that we really don't care we really don't care what you do domestically. Right?
Yeah.
It's,
exactly.
This is we've gone a long way from world revolution, right? In the communist world, China is not a Marxist-Leninist state in the same way that the Soviet Union was. They were also not autarkic, at least since the 1980s, and have very enthusiastically traded with the world, tried to trade with the world in order to create their own industrialization. Compared to their failed industrialization under Mao during the Great Leap Forward, where it was autarkic and they tried to replace capital with labor, and that didn't go very well. But as Andrew alluded to, and not going well is perhaps the understatement of the century.
Understatement of an understatement.
Yeah. Again, we don't know how many people died. It's still debated, but tens of millions died. But anyway, I think we've really touched on this really, Emma, you really touched on this really interesting aspect here, which is how does a communist state, which I think we can all agree under Xi Jinping has re-embraced many aspects of its communism. Maybe not all of it. Xi Jinping thought might not be perfect Marxism, but has embraced many of at least the principles, the original principles and themes of Marxism. How does a state like that position itself as the most reliable partner, as a reliable international? And how does it do that while not losing the principles at home?
That is one of the most interesting components to the CCC and maintaining legitimacy that I find so interesting because it is fascinating. The original thought was a very big disdain and reluctance for the Western system, and then they come in 2000, enter the World Trade Organization, and then just take it all by storm. It it's very interesting on how they kind of like again legitimize their international objectives domestically. But I would say there's the communist like collective there's the communist ideology, but then under Xi Jinping specifically, I think we've seen a much larger nationalist ideology coming. I wouldn't say it's revisionist, like so far as to like, as much as like some people project that it could be. However, that nationalist ideology is what has like we talked about Hu Jin Zhao, and like his approach to Taiwan was a little more, if you go declare independence, then we're going to act. And then Xi Jinping is a little bit more like, before I leave, you will be ours. Like he has been much more kind of like aggressive, and again that nationalist idea. Like people really do believe in China as like a superior power. It's China's turn. They had the century of humiliation, and now it is their turn to take on the world and kind of claim their deserved power. But in terms of like just being reliable and commitment, I think what they've really kind of articulated is, we don't have 4-year election cycles that swing like a pendulum. We're not going to go back on international commitments. We're not going to pull out of multilateral institutions. We have at least consistency, even if it's not, again, as aligned values-wise as some of the countries they're trying to make that pitch to.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, that's I really like how you described that. That was really good. Of course, the problem with their we don't have elections every 4 years, and therefore we don't tear up international agreements, is all of that depends on the leader or the coterie of people around the leader on the Central Committee. For instance, Mao didn't have elections every 4 years. Mao couldn't be relied on for anything, right? You would not necessarily want to sign an agreement with Mao, because he would turn it on his head as soon as he saw advantage in it. And so while I think you have had a series of leaders that are even in Xi Jinping predictable, for lack of a better
I think
word.
that's what they're trying to market. Yeah, with the 5-year plan, and they want to be predictable, if nothing else.
Yeah. Now Mao had his own 5-year plans, but and so does Stalin, pioneer Stalin. But it's I think you're right. I think there's this attempt to project stability. However, Andrew, let me ask you this: how much stability do you think there can possibly be in the Chinese Central Committee, knowing what you know about China?
That's a great question. I don't know if I've ever looked at it from that angle. I think there's a fundamental, I don't want to say divide, but there's the lower echelon of Chinese society and your upper echelon of Chinese society. And your upper echelon will be like the Central Committee. It'll be a lot of these like billionaires, millionaires that are connected in some way to the government, because they need to be in order to actually survive under the government. And then the lower echelons, who's like your average worker, your average blue collar, maybe even like white collar suburban person. But I don't think that this lower echelon really fully understands what's going on at the upper echelon. I think the upper echelon, the top, has done a really good job at kind of disguising what's been going on. And honestly, if we look at the Central Committee now, the way I see it, something is going to happen once Xi Jinping dies. I mean, he is the longest reigning leader of China since Mao, basically. And I don't know if it was 2021, 2023, they amended the constitution to basically repeal term limits, so he can serve as long as he wants. And if we're going off of precedent, he'll probably win 2027. So the only thing that he has going that could get him out of office is death at this point. He has secured a very stable position within the Chinese Communist Party, but after that, and we need to think long term because China plans long term. They don't. America and a lot of Western countries, because we run on these 4, 6, 8 year like election cycles, we plan very short term. China plans for the next century basically, and it's what they've been doing. But China's political situation, I think, the upper echelon, it's always chaotic. It's always going to be chaotic. And one way of looking at it is in ancient China, medieval China, there was like the court system, like the imperial court with like the eunuchs. I don't think that went away. I think it simply transformed. The way we should see the CCP is not like a breakaway, although I did kind of see as somewhat of a breakaway, but not really like a breakaway, but kind of a red dynasty almost. And what we're seeing is that the court eunuchs, basically all the people in the central committee, they're always in conflict. The only way I could see it getting worse is honestly in the same way that the Chinese dynastic cycle always ends, is that eventually corruption, nepotism gets to the like central leadership and eventually we'll see a collapse. And honestly, we're starting to see that slowly but surely. I don't think that in the next 10 years like there's going to be some sudden change, but give it 10, 30, 40 years, something big, I cannot say what, but something big will happen in China because the Chinese leadership class, because it is a class, it's becoming entrenched. It used to be that you could rise from anything and become, what's it called again? Become the leader of China. I mean, Xi Jinping's father was literally shamed during the Cultural Revolution, and Xi Jinping was literally like a farmer in, I don't know, but in rural China,
Well,
and then
he lived
ended
in a
up being the
cave
leader
for
of
like
China.
2 years.
Yeah, he lived in a cave. He lived in a cave. And then he ended up becoming the leader of China. I don't know if that'll be the case because that's just how societies work, I think, is it's just this leadership class will become more entrenched. A good example we could look at is Mao's grandson who has no military experience, who's utterly incompetent, unqualified. He's a military general and he's like but the only reason he got there is because he's the grandson of Mao. And but what's it called again? But we're starting to see this where there's basically an entrenchment of this leadership class. The same families are basically going into power. It's not going to be like anyone can get into that upper echelon. It's becoming increasingly not a smaller circle, but a harder to get into circle. And I think that'll end up biting them back later when, again, nepotism, corruption. I think it's the natural course of any leadership class. It'll get to them. So give it 10, 20, 30, 40 years. We'll see something. That like, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking in very vague terms, but it's like I will admit I haven't thought about it before. But that's such a great question. But it's like they do a good job at making sure that the commoner does not really feel a lot of the massive ripple effects of whatever happens in the upper echelon. Like the Gang of Four, a lot of the stuff they were doing was very clandestine, and most people didn't know it until other members of the Chinese like Communist Party began to like shun them in like the daily newspaper or something. So yeah, the political structure in China, like their biggest thing is time, but I think it's just inevitable. And again, I'm sorry if I'm speaking vagaries, but it's just such a big question.
Sure, I don't think there's any way around to speak in vagaries. I mean, I'm also asking you to speculate. You don't have it in. Nobody has a way of
Of course
actually
not.
understanding. We're doing Kremlinology here, or Zheng Nanhai-nology, or something, which makes it, which is never easy. But one of the things that I think, it's as China's trying to position itself as a more reliable global partner than the United States, and China can point to political turmoil in the United States and the fact that things can seemingly change on a dime, which was not the case for a long time, but it's but I just wonder how you can trust in a global era a society that, or a governing apparatus that can never be held accountable. There's no mechanism in the Chinese constitution. There are theoretical mechanisms to hold the government accountable, but there are no actual mechanisms to hold the leadership accountable. Xi Jinping can just purge his way out of accountability. had Mao been actually accountable, he would have been out 3 years before he was with the Great Leap Forward. Maybe Hu Jintao and Deng Xiaoping, at their peak of their powers, nobody necessarily wanted them. But functionally, there's nothing to hold a system like this accountable when, as you mentioned, Andrew, there's this trend towards nepotism. There's this trend toward a solidification of a truly elite red communist class that is going to be difficult to dislodge. And all you're going to end up with, as you mentioned, Andrew, is court politics.
It's just going to be a continuation of the imperial dynastic cycle. I don't think it truly ended. It just transformed. Yeah, yeah.
So, Emma, if you're dealing with, to put your IR hat on, despite the projections of stability, and perhaps it is truly stable right now with the leadership in Beijing. I mean, I think we saw the last time that the Central Committee was announced. And this is, when you're a China watcher, this is what you have to do, is you have to because things are so secret, right? That what you do is you literally, when they come out after the election, they've been nominated, you have to watch the order they come out in, and you have to watch the distance between how far the first person from the second person comes out. And that tells you, that's the signal of how much power somebody has. And the last time that happened, Xi Jinping walks out first, and there was a historically long difference between when the next guy walks out. And I don't remember who the next guy was. But so, this is what you have to do. These are the tea leaves you have to read, are these insane things like that. So maybe, you've got this incredibly powerful central figure in Xi Jinping. But from an international relations context, how can you predict beyond Xi Jinping?
That, I think, is definitely China's biggest struggle right now. I would say it's a personal failure on Xi Jinping and his reluctance to kind of outline or even conceptualize a successor figure, because that offers, again, nothing to the international community. That's the problem, because she has been every time there's a joke that essentially every time a high-ranking official of the CCP is suspected to possibly be a successor, they're automatically ousted. And since he keeps the circle so tight on these things, I think you really are raising a problem for the continuity of the CCP that I don't think they had following Deng Xiaoping. And I even though the leaders do change drastically, I think she's reluctance to kind of seem like he wants to pass the baton on definitely poses the chance for there to be a hiccup or disruption in the way that power transition goes, especially, again, he's getting old. If the plan is not solidified, it's going to be a very big, I think, reputational crisis for China as in terms of their stability argument. However, if they are able to effectively kind of pass the baton in a non-disruptive way, I don't think that their kind of continuity is going to be eroded, even though the leader it's on an individual. You can't exactly predict what they're going to do, but I do think the long-term strategy and cohesive, very unified messaging of the CCP, as long as there's a successor plan, I don't think it'll be too disruptive to their international standing.
Interesting. How does Taiwan view Xi Jinping?
I believe Taiwan views Xi Jinping as definitely a big strong man with a historical grievance, in the sense that, again, China CCP has wanted reunification with Taiwan for a while. However, Xi came in and he took a step where it was it was more we don't want you to declare independence. It is, you will be reunify China. So he's definitely seen as more of like an enforcer figure for that like threat, I guess, to the Taiwanese. Like I don't know how they kind of gauged that with previous leaders, but now it really is, of course, something that is very real and tangible. And he's also been exercising lots of, of course, the PLA military exercises and things like that. And I think it's just like they see Xi as that, he really wants to demonstrate his power, his capability, his strength, what he can do. A little fear mongering, strategic and beauty. Strategic and ambiguity is a big thing for Xi as well. He's very good at like showing power, but not being very explicit, and like, which allows him to not like fail on fulfilling demands because he doesn't specify what he really planned on doing. You just see what was actually produced.
Well, again, this is a guy who managed to rise to the top of Chinese Central Committee politics, and you don't get that without some strategic ambiguity, without really understanding.
All from a cave.
Yeah,
all from
right?
the cave too.
From the cave to Iowa, to the chairman of the Central Committee. And I mean, yeah, and that's the thing for people who don't know. Actually, Xi Jinping spent quite a while in Iowa. Actually, so he's actually probably more familiar with aspects of the United States than any other Chinese leader. I can't remember how long he was there, but he spent time living with a family in Ohio when he was a young man after the cave.
Yeah,
and strangely, there's like for like Chinese people who live in the United States, it's kind of become like this pilgrimage site where he lived in Iowa. So.
Interesting. I actually did not know about that.
Yeah,
I didn't know about that either.
Really? Okay, yeah. And so there's a family who lives there. I can't remember, but they hosted it, right? Like it was like an exchange thing. And up until very, very recently, at least, they were writing letters to each other on a regular basis.
That's actually so awesome.
Yeah.
They were writing. Yeah. We hosted the future leader of China.
Personal letters, like
it's cool. Yeah.
Happy New Year. Nothing, and congratulations on the grandkids, stuff like that. Like very.
Yeah.
Like.
Very just normal, like ignoring all the politics, just
totally
the leader of China and a family. Yeah. That's amazing. That's so cool.
And in fact, there are some people who've speculated it's like weirdly Xi's, like for a while at least, was like Xi's strongest non-specific family, like personal relationship. It's like this old Iowa farm family.
Interesting.
I think there's one of the reasons this isn't publicized that much is I think the U.S. government, the U.S. press specifically, doesn't want like there to be like a huge. They don't want this family to become like majorly prominent. They don't want them to be, because they love C.
Yeah.
Right. They love them. They don't want them. They don't want them to become a propaganda. A very prominent propaganda mouthpiece for the CCP, which they would be.
Of course not.
While being, I think, honestly, just decent people. They would be, and so I think that's kind of why it's kind of kept on the down low. But yeah, like if you look into it, it's there. And I can't remember it here. I'll look it up right now. I'll find out what town it was in Iowa while I'm because now it's
that is fascinating.
Iowa and Xi Jinping. Iowa and Xi Jinping relationship. 40-year-old friends relationship during his 1985 visit to Muscatine.
Muscatine, Iowa. Yeah, Muscatine, Iowa. Yeah. Along the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, so fun times, right? But anyway, I mean, he didn't rise to the top of Chinese politics by not being able to play these incredibly sophisticated games. And that means sophisticated games in order to keep other people in the Communist Party in the dark about various things, other high-ranking officials, but also the rest of the world. And it does become, without trying to be conspiratorial about it, it is sort of this notion of like, what you don't fully know what he's up to. because he's a leader, he's managed to get to that point. You can't possibly know that. And it's a system that weeds out anybody who might even be who is not the absolute strongest politician you could possibly imagine.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think you have to be you have to be like that because every leader before that has had to be like that. Deng, Mao, Jiang, Hu, like they've all had to be like that.
Precisely. So, the last question I'm going to ask is, how do you think the slowing of growth in the Chinese economy? I mean, I'm asking you to speculate, but Andrew, let's start with you, and I'll give Emma the last word. But Andrew, how do you see the slowing of the Chinese economy, the growth, the CCP's relationship with the Chinese people, credibility in China?
I mean, the 2020s have not been the best for the Chinese economy. It's still growing, of course, but there were I don't know if y'all remember, but like a couple years ago, there's always those news articles being like the Chinese GDP is expected to surpass the U.S. by 2025, 2026, but that hasn't happened. Like they're still growing, but the Chinese economic miracle is over. The housing market, I don't know exact specifics, but I know the housing market's not in the best condition. The yuan is just a very weak currency. Like it's about 7 yuan to $1. And I know they do that intentionally to intentionally devalue the currency, so exports just are better for that. But honestly, the economy is not the main thing I see being the problem. What I really see being the main problem, but it is very much tied to the economy, is the population growth. China's population is slowly starting to go down, and I think that's what's going to prevent them, honestly, from surpassing the United States as a global power. The United States, technically we are below like replacement level, but we have streams of immigration that come in that help to grow our population. China doesn't have that. They're very tightly controlled in terms of migration, and their population is going down. The average median age in China is 40. So honestly, unless they automate a lot of these jobs, which would previously be done by like unskilled labor or something, they're gonna have a real big problem on their hands. And again, it's just one of those inevitabilities where their population is just gonna go down, and they're just gonna slow down. It's a ticking time bomb they kind of added onto themselves with the advent of the one-child policy, and eventually they relaxed it to two-child, but it's kind of too late, and honestly, they're just gonna have to go through the effects. But yeah, the Chinese economy, it's slowed, and I don't know how it's going to be able to keep up with the increased military spending, especially under the Xi regime. But that's just, again, it's just a matter of speculation. We'll just have to see where it goes.
My last question for you is about, you mentioned nationalism earlier. I want you to talk a little bit about the relationship between the CCP and Han nationalism.
And you said Han nationalism?
Yeah, or Chinese nationalism, but I mean, I think a lot of that's related to Han ethnic nationalism too.
Yeah, I think a lot of that like nationalism comes again like the Han, the unification. It was all kind of a reaction to the chaos and disorder that followed. I mean that came before it historically, just like of course the Civil War, the fighting, all these kinds of things. So when they unified this Han culture, solidified the character system and things like this, it was like it was the unification of the country in like all of its national power. And I think for a lot of Chinese individuals, it didn't feel like they had to now like work with like competitors or opponents. It was more just like thank goodness the fighting is over. Let's do like everything we can to become as strong as possible and not fight and just like project peace. Like they were very willing to go along with a lot of like the CCP's like again overreach because of this like they were exhausted from fighting. They just wanted to be like stable and peaceful and all these things. So the CCP was really able to go in at this time and just like kind of solidify things to a standard, and people were very willing to conform to that standard at that time in history. That in a different time, maybe people would have felt again a little more like attached to their own regional cultural aspects and things like this. But it's really worked towards the nationalism, and just like, again, China's such a massive country. It's actually like just so um, hard to for me to conceptualize how different the regions are and all that kind of thing. But the fact that they can come together in a unified way and project that national power, and not demonstrate like North and South deflections or disagreements and domestic internal disagreements, has been very effective.
Yeah, and I think one of the major domestic propaganda pieces, it's almost a threat that Xi Jinping uses at the time, is that we don't want the Cultural Revolution again, do it, and that everything is sort of framed through this notion or this lens of you must unify, you must stay stable, you must not disagree with me, because otherwise we get the Cultural Revolution again. Now, of course, Xi Jinping doesn't acknowledge that the Cultural Revolution was started by the leadership of the Communist Party. But, it is certainly this traumatic memory, or this traumatic period in Chinese history. And, Xi's family, as Andrew mentioned, suffered from it as badly as many families did. Again, he had to live on a farm as essentially slave labor while living in a cave. So it is sort of this memory of the complete chaos and anarchy of the Cultural Revolution. It is a period of anarchy, frankly, and levying that as a threat to sort of ensure consistency, compliance, and unity, which is anyway. And so, and I'm always amazed by that, because I'm like, I think of the Cultural Revolution, although being anarchic, being purposeful. But anyway, all right. I guess I gave myself the last word. That's my prerogative as the host, I guess. Yeah, I was gonna say, Emma, Andrew,
I wanted to
thank you
thank
very much
you.
for coming
Yeah.
on. That was a great discussion.
Again,
Thank you for
thank you,
having
Rob.
me.
That was amazing. And hey, if you want to talk about China again, you know where to hit us up.
Yes.
Like if you want to talk about that Cultural Revolution episode that or like that lost media that you made, hey, you could do it again, but with new guests.
Yes, bring it back, please.
No, you know what? I'm committed. Let's do a Cultural Revolution episode.
I'm completely down. Like, I'm like genuinely completely down for this. I'm serious.
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right.
Yes.
Well,
thank you so much. You've had
Emma,
us on.
Andrew, thank you for coming on, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank
All right,
you.
it's been a pleasure. As they say in China, 再见.
再见.
Thanks for putting up with the technical difficulties, guys. Good work.